Welcome, everyone. My name is Maelle Pelisson, and I'm the Advocacy Director for the Business for Nature Coalition. I am joining you today from London, which is maybe not the most appropriate for an EU Green Week session, but I'm still very much delighted to moderate our session today, Nature is Everyone's Business, Building a Business for Biodiversity Movement. The Business for Nature Coalition was created a bit more than a year ago, thanks to the generous financial support of the European Commission. Our objective is to demonstrate existing business action for nature and to unify a powerful business voice calling on governments to adopt policies and regulation to reverse nature loss. Over the last year, we've seen actually a real change on the nature agenda with a growing interest from the business community. And with the current pandemic and the economic crisis, we could have expected that the business would pull away from this topic, as it is still sometimes seen as far away from the core business strategies. But actually, we are experiencing the opposite. In fact, just a few weeks ago, during the UN Biodiversity Summit, Business for Nature announced the Nature is Everyone's Business call to action. And through this call to action, more than 600 companies, representing $4.1 trillion of annual revenues, are now calling for collective actions on nature and urging governments to adopt policies now to reverse nature loss in this decade. So this growing momentum is really showing that there's a growing understanding from the business community that future economic development and resilience rely on nature. And in fact, I think you all notice that almost every week, there's a new report that is being published, bringing more evidence of the economic and social risk of the current nature loss crisis and the current climate change crisis. So this is something we cannot ignore anymore. And this is something that businesses are not ignoring because their resilience and their long-term survival is at stake. So this is why businesses are starting to act. And today we will have the chance to hear from concrete examples from businesses that are acting on the ground. But something that is very clear as well is that business action, while voluntary business action, while being very important, are not enough anymore. And also, something that is very clear is that businesses cannot address this global nature loss crisis on their own. For business to be able to scale up and speed up action, we need the right policies in place. We need policies that create a positive feedback loop that encourage further business action. So today, we're very happy for this session to have four great speakers with us. So first of all, we will hear from two representatives from companies that have signed the call to action, Nature is Everyone's Business. So we will hear from Mr. Cédric de Meeûs, the Vice President of Public Affairs at LafargeHolcim, and Mrs. Pascale Moreau, the Public Affairs Sustainability Europe Manager at the H&M Group. They will both tell us how they are facing this nature loss challenge and how they are transforming their business to become nature positive. But we're also delighted to have with us Mr. Humberto Rosa Delgado, the Director of the Natural Capital Unit at DG Environment here at the European Commission. And he will tell us how governments can also demonstrate leadership to encourage more business action. And finally, also because we have mentioned the need for collective action, we are joined today by Mr. João Meneses, the Secretary-General of the Business Council for Sustainable Development Portugal, who will present the new initiative Act for Nature Portugal that was launched a few weeks ago. So just to try also to keep this session interactive, we will keep some time at the end of the session to have a Q&A with our panelists. So please feel free in the audience to already ask a question or ask a question when the panelists are speaking. You can click on the question mark button that is at the bottom of your screen. So now, without further ado, I would like to call on our first speaker, Cédric. So Cédric, if you could please unmute yourself and tell us more about Lafarge's recent climate pledge and the actions that LafargeHolcim is taking towards becoming nature positive. So thank you so much, Cédric. The floor is yours.
Thanks a lot. Just checking that you hear me and see me properly.
Do.
Okay, very good. Thank you for inviting me to this great conversation. And perhaps before I start into the climate pledge, I would like to focus on why we've joined the call to action. And I will start by by reflecting on what we've been doing. We've been working on biodiversity for many years across all our sites in all regions of the world. And for instance, we've been and working in partnership with IUCN for a number of years, developing an integrated biodiversity management system. We call it the BEARS, the Biodiversity Indicator and Reporting System, which gives us a tool to monitor biodiversity at site level for each and every site, assessing the suitability, if I can put it that way, of extraction sites and activity sites to harbor conservation and biodiversity management. And on the back of that, you develop at site level a biodiversity management plan. And I could give you all sorts of figures, how many countries and a large proportion of our sites having achieved that, and so on and so forth. But this is not the point. The point is that is great, but it's not enough by far. And this is why we've decided to engage ourselves in the call to action and the work that Business for Nature is leading, because we need to start looking outside our strict boundaries. Focusing on biodiversity in our quarries, for instance, is of course it's a priority, and of course it's super important. But we need to, if we are to have an active contribution to reversing nature loss by 2030, we need to start looking beyond the individual site. For instance, we are a quite large landowner, actually looking recently larger than we thought we would be. How can we more proactively manage this land, including in terms of water management and water stewardship within water basins, better resources management to manage extraction and save resources. I will talk in a minute about our climate pledge. And by taking such approach, for example, get through this large land that we use, can we contribute to wildlife corridors? This is not something that we've been looking at in any detail in the past, and I think this is the next step in looking outside our strict boundaries side by side and take a broader and more holistic approach. And this is exactly the spirit of the pledge, the net zero pledge that we announced at the occasion of the new Climate Week New York 3 weeks ago, where we've joined the UN Global Compact ambition to 1.5 degrees campaign and the race to zero with the UNFCCC. And that is committing to the net zero agenda with SBTI, science-based targets, roadmaps. Those are roadmaps establishing a pathway which is externally verified by SBTI, CDP, and so on, that gives us a 1.5 trajectory. Now, that of course requires to manage our own environment, but it also requires us to go outside our strict boundaries and look at how do we introduce carbon neutrals to start with, net zero at the second stage, net zero products, to start engage with the value chain, because what society is looking for is not net zero cement. What society is looking for is net zero construction, net zero building. And with the current COVID crisis, we've seen that the role that our houses, our buildings, our infrastructure plays is more important than ever. And that's what we need to figure out, is how we're going to respond to societal expectations in terms of first century and the net zero ambition that is being developed across all jurisdictions. And that's engaging. For us, it means starting to engage with architects, with planners, with city developers on what are the solutions and how we can contribute to it. And I think exactly the same spirit applies to biodiversity and the call to action and the collaboration with Business for Nature. So I propose to stop here and leave more time for discussion.
Thank you very much, Cédric. Very interesting to hear the commitment of Lafarge to become a net zero company and the work you're doing with the science-based targets. And actually, the Science-Based Target Network is currently working on setting science-based target for nature. And they recently, a few weeks ago, published some guidance for businesses on the action that companies can already start taking today. And hopefully that should provide some additional supports to the business community to continue transforming the way they're working. But I would like to now turn to Pascale from the H&M Group. So the H&M Group has made a commitment to become climate positive by 2040 and also to become fully circular. So Pascale, if you could please unmute yourself and tell us why the H&M Group signed the call to action, Nature is Everyone's Business, and what are the priority actions that your group is taking to meet these commitments? So thank you so much, Pascale. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Maelle, and lovely to be here. Indeed, we H&M Group has been having a lot of quite ambitious vision at climate and circular economy, and that's why also it was for us really a no-brainer to sign the call to action from Business for Nature, because we believe circular economy and climate change cannot go without biodiversity approach. So it's really why we were also at Davos, really at the beginning of the discussions with Business for Nature, with governments earlier this year. And we really believe, yes, indeed, that we have a need for international call to action, as Cédric was mentioning, and also in previous sessions during the EU Green Week. We need to look beyond our own boundaries, and we need to ensure that all actions are taken at international level. It's great to have the EU taking the lead, but if other governments do not follow the efforts, then we will not be able to tackle that global challenge that we are facing with biodiversity loss. So it's really important for us to have that international call to action. And also the reason why we believe it's really an important call to action is we can only achieve such change and leading and having an international framework if we collaborate all together. So business, governments, but also NGOs. So that's, I think it's really a key point of the call to action, and calling for share the responsibilities. So for business to take actions, but also for governments to lead the way and to have an implementation frameworks that are aligned across the globe. As you know, we have a global supply chain. So if in different countries we have different framework when it comes to biodiversity, we will not be able to actually lead the way collectively. And that's something we really think the call to action is putting forward. And it's even more important now that we actually launch our biodiversity ambition in September earlier this year. And it's that we see Business for Nature as a baseline to really drive our ambition. Our biodiversity long-term vision is to have a net positive impact on biodiversity. And you will see it's quite in line with our circular economy vision to be 100% circular, and our climate target of climate positive by 2040. But why did we set up that biodiversity ambition? I think there was a session on the biodiversity impacts of garment and footwear industry earlier during the Green Week. So it might be a bit of repeat for those who listen to that session. But our impact from our industries are mainly our raw materials and resources used. For example, cotton is using lots of land, water, and chemicals. And by looking at that, hotspot, we will also have some impact on circularity. So everything goes hands in hands. We also have impact from biodiversity level at production, transport, for example, movement of invasive species, and also at use phase with the microfibers release. So it just really makes sense to have a biodiversity ambition and vision for H&M Group is really having a holistic approach, as I was saying, about climate and circular economy ambition, but also to make sure that we have a resilient business. And we've seen that with the COVID-19 crisis, and it's even more important when it comes to sustainability, our vision. So when it comes to biodiversity, we are a bit more, let's say, at earlier stage. That's what Cédric was mentioning. Our two objectives are to prevent and reduce our company overall impact, but also to help to protect and restore biodiversity. And for doing so, we have, let's say, 3 core buckets of actions. At the moment, we are assessing our biodiversity footprint at all levels, all the impact hotspots that I was mentioning earlier on. And we are evaluating the results so that we can really create relevant KPIs in the coming months and years. And we also, coming back to the call to action, we want to make sure that our own KPIs are set in collaboration and in line with the international framework. So here again, collaboration is very key with international authorities and governments, but also NGOs such as WWF, but also organizations such as Business for Nature, Fashion Pact, IPBES, and others. So that's really important. And also to ensure that we know exactly where we source from so that we can identify the various impacts in the different regions. As Cédric said, it's not only in our own boundaries and we need to look further. So here the impact at region level could be the soil, the animal, under and above ground, and also people health. It was mentioned in previous sessions that we need also to integrate social aspects into biodiversity, and that's how we will integrate that. So in really a nutshell, this is what we are doing, and we really believe in the call to action to really define an international framework that really move the needle and put everybody on the same level of playing field.
Thank you very much, Pascale, and very, very impressive to hear this leadership, and congratulations on the launch of your biodiversity ambition. And I think particularly your message on how everything is connected will probably resonate with the audience today, because this is something that has become so clear with the current pandemic, that all our systems are interconnected and that we won't be able to build a resilient economy and to reach our sustainable development goals if we don't address nature and climate together. So thanks for your leadership on this. It's been great to hear from Pascale and Cédric these concrete examples on how companies are acting on the ground and really starting to integrate nature into their core business strategies. And as I mentioned earlier, H&M and LafargeHolcim are 2 of the 600 companies that signed the Nature is Everyone's Business call to action. So maybe now let's hear from CEOs from other companies that are part of this initiative. And for that, we will watch a short video. So if we can start the video.
The science is clear. Nature is everyone's business, and the next 10 years are critical.
We must reverse nature loss before we reach a tipping point from which ecosystems will not recover.
We are proud of applying our science to drive innovation that helps reverse nature loss.
How we can work together as a human community to respond fast, better.
By recovering waste as a source of energy and a source for raw materials, we are preserving Earth's resources and shaping cleaner cities.
Cost of inaction is too high when it comes to nature loss.
We believe that we nourish people by nature with very healthy dairy products, but we can only do that if we nourish the planet.
We measure the impact on biodiversity at portfolio level and strive for a net positive gain in 2030.
We need governments and policymakers to also be transformative and create new laws and frameworks, and of course in collaboration then with businesses that needs to step up with their actions and their commitments.
Only by working together with governments, communities and societies will we be able to create a healthy planet for everyone.
We need to develop and implement frameworks that integrate the value of nature in decision-making and global market mechanisms.
Policies that make the best available technologies mainstream, transparently measure their impacts, and integrate sustainability into the education system.
I welcome rules regulation which encourage circular economy on climate and incentivize companies to have a positive impact on biodiversity.
We owe it to our stakeholders and to the next generation of stakeholders to protect nature.
Our collective future depends on global communities coming together to ensure a greener and more inclusive tomorrow.
Wonderful. Very inspiring to hear all the CEOs taking a stand on nature and calling for more ambitious policies. And that actually leads us then very nicely to our next speaker, Humberto, who is representing this much needed government leadership. So the European Commission published in May its biodiversity strategy together with the farm to fork strategy. And it actually proposes a set of measures to enable transformative change. But it also positioned the EU as a leading force in the current international UN negotiations on the global biodiversity framework that is expected to be adopted next year at the Biodiversity COP15. So Humberto, maybe could you please unmute yourself, and can you tell us how this business call for more ambitious policies resonates with you personally and as a policymaker? And can you tell us more about the EU strategy to reverse nature loss? Thank you, Humberto. Over to you.
Maelle, I hope you listen to me well. It actually resonates a lot, including in myself personally. I was already quite impressed by this call of action. Over 600 companies, revenues over $4 trillion US, calling our governments to act. That's very telling. But these testimonies we've heard are also in itself very telling that business has noticed. So let me just some words of context. I think it's really very opportune to have this debate in the European context when we have the European Green Deal as the overall guiding strategy. It's not only an environmental strategy, it's an economic and social strategy. How did we get here? Well, the situation of the environment globally and in Europe is very harsh. We did develop as humans, but it came with a cost. We've degraded the biosphere, atmosphere, land, ocean. And the invoices started coming, extreme weather events, plastics in the oceans, wildfires, pollinators disappearing. And it means science informs, people notice, the youth has noticed, businesses have noticed, and thus politics have noticed. That's why I think we have a Green Deal. And this Green Deal has recognized that natural capital as provided by nature is indeed the bedrock of the economy and society. We are all strictly dependent, business included, on the services the biosphere provides us, and we don't have technology to replace those services. And therefore, the Green Deal made quite a strong stance on biodiversity. making it the other side of the coin together with climate change for global sustainability, and telling us that we as EU should lead by example also on biodiversity, as we have done for climate. So indeed, we do have a very ambitious biodiversity strategy proposed for 2030 that I think paves the way towards what level of ambition, what kind of transformative change we should aim with a global deal. I don't mean, of course, that what serves for the EU must serve for the others, but we certainly must collectively at the global level address all the main drivers, get some quantified targets, some more measurability of biodiversity towards what we want, where we want to be in 2030, to align for this 2050 vision where we should live in harmony with nature, with ecosystems healthy everywhere, and no further avoidable human-induced extinctions. So I think what we display on increased ambition and quantified for more protected areas, for nature restoration, for reducing the pressures and changing the approaches on land use, on agriculture and agroecology, on forestry, on the oceans and fisheries, greening our cities, free-flowing rivers, financing, governance, we are saying what we would like the world to achieve. And this does include quite a lot on more measurability. So on this, I would say if you look to the EU biodiversity strategy in its 20+ pages, there's a little but very relevant chapter also on measuring the value of ecosystem services and taking them into account in decision making. And this also applies for business. There's also some words on accounting and measuring the business relationships with nature in all decisions, public and private. This must become a norm on all sectors. And many of the policies we are working, some of which referred in the biodiversity strategy, go in this direction. The new revised sustainable finance strategy, the so-called taxonomy regulation defining what are sustainable investments, the review of the non-financial reporting directive, the new rules for sustainable corporate governance, and also an initiative on green claims, so to allow consumers to make better informed choices, which I think is a very important aspect. So I would say we also have a lot ongoing of collaboration with business within the EU Business and Biodiversity Platform. We have a lot of expectation from the LIFE project Transparent that we have promoted in cooperation with the Value Balancing Alliance, involving partners like BASF, Novartis, the Deutsche Bank, contributions from Ernst & Young, KPMG, Deloitte, PricewaterhouseCoopers, towards more standardized methods for natural capital accounting. So in essence, for business, I would say they must be and are part of the solution, but for that it's essential that the corporate decision makers gain insights into both the impacts and dependencies of their products and processes on wider natural capital throughout the value chain. By the way, for those interested, we are having platform webinar. The EU Biodiversity Platform is having some webinar series on these issues, and there's one this afternoon on biodiversity measurement approaches for the financial sector. You can find it in the EU Business and Biodiversity site. So to end up, I do think that accounting for natural capital and biodiversity is key. Our society and businesses and economy are built upon the foundations of natural capital and services, and we cannot, through human action, replace what nature gives us. So let's get the accounts right, and we may save the world. Thank you.
Much, Humberto, for showing such leadership and actually very much welcomed by the business community. And this government leadership has also been recently demonstrated by the adoption of the Leaders' Pledge for Nature by 77 heads of state and government, and also by the President of the European Commission. And that's a pledge that commits countries to reverse biodiversity loss by 2030. So this is a great sign, but we're also hoping that this level of ambition will be translated into a strong international agreement next year at the Biodiversity COP15 in China, but also in regional and national policies. So maybe now, just to continue on the Portuguese dynamic, it is my pleasure to introduce João, who has been the leading force behind the Act for Nature Portugal initiative. So João, if you could please unmute yourself and tell us more about this initiative and the growing business momentum that you're experiencing in Portugal. So João, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, first of all, for the invitation. It's my great pleasure to be here. And to Etienne, just to say that I have more words. I don't have graphics, but hopefully they won't be too heavy. So just to give you as a background before jumping into the Act for Nature Portugal experience, I mean, as we all know, nature is, of course, at serious risk. For the last, over the last 50 years, we've lost 60% of the wildlife, and scientists are warning us that we're entering a sixth mass extinction of life on Earth. The previous and last one, as you know, was 66 million years ago, but the difference to this one is that this time, this mass extinction of life on Earth is due to our impact on planet Earth, not to any external cause. So this has a first remark, context, a background for Act for Nature Portugal. As a second remark, I would say that, I mean, there was here a timeline 1 year ago, the WBCSD, World Business Council for Sustainable Development, gathered in Lisbon, in Portugal. So they have this annual gathering called a council meeting, and last year, precisely 1 year ago, it happened in Lisbon. And we took that chance, that opportunity to involve the global network of WBCSD and to build with the global network an initiative and sign a common commitment around biodiversity. I mean, as Humberto just said, the dependencies and impacts of companies throughout their value chain on biodiversity, natural capital, and ecosystem services. That commitment was called Lisbon Declaration, and it was signed by at least 25 members of the global network of WBCSD. So the main idea behind this Lisbon Declaration was to take the French initiative, the well-succeeded, I would say, French initiative launched in 2018 called Act for Nature, take it to the world, replicate it, scale it up, and replicate it in as many countries as we could. So at least 25 of these global network countries signed this declaration, committing themselves to replicate this French initiative called Act for Nature. So BCSD Portugal, meanwhile, became member of the Business for Nature, a global coalition. And for the last 10 months, I would say, we've been working on adapting and replicating Act for Nature France. The idea of Act for Nature is basically to help companies identify the solutions required to protect and to protect and restore biodiversity and ecosystem services, namely through the following practices. On one hand, we help them working through their own operations in value chains to identify, reduce, and avoid impacts, while also identifying dependencies, nature-based solutions, and other opportunities to create benefits for nature and people, the New Deal for nature and people. Secondly, we lead this collaboration across all sectors of society in landscapes, river basins, and seascapes to ensure ecosystem conservation and restoration and the supply of ecosystem services delivered by nature to society and the economy. And thirdly, we help by through Act for Nature Portugal, we help on the implementing systemic change to organizations and business models by identifying impacts and dependencies on natural capital and taking nature into account when making decisions, disclosure and reporting. And finally, we recommend and we promote policy changes to governments to establish the policy frameworks needed to drive economic changes at scale. So what happened, this is the main goals of Act for Nature, and that should happen across the world. But of course, we've adopted these goals as the main goals of Act for Nature in Portugal. And companies, very practically, companies must commit around 10 general and common commitments, of course, related with the preservation of biodiversity and natural capital. We all depend on nature and ecosystem services. And then they must identify 2 specific measures to implement officially in a period of 2 years. We've officially launched the Act for Nature Portugal last month. We had the Minister of the Environment with us. We had the pleasure and many other speakers and stakeholders of the ecosystem. And we had with us, at that time, 1 month ago, 17 member companies of Act for Nature Portugal. So it was launched with endorsement and commitment of 17 Portuguese companies. But the idea of Act for Nature is to work on it throughout the decade. So we're facing this very critical decade, as many previous speakers said. And so the idea, this is a commitment through the decade, to the decade ahead. And the idea is to build new commitments with new companies for the coming 10 years. So these 17 companies are already committed with the 10 common principles. They are identifying, and we'll be releasing that next month, the 2 specific initiatives, the 2 specific measures that will help them improve and take bold action towards biodiversity. But we will gather many other companies in the next year and in the coming years, and every 2 years we will revise their commitments, and we will help them step by step to become more committed towards the valuing of biodiversity throughout their value chains and becoming net nature positive, of course. And that's basically what we're doing. These 17 companies, Portuguese companies, they represent a large part of our GDP, or I wouldn't say a large, but a relevant part of our GDP, as they are large companies, some of them listed, public companies listed on our stock exchange. So they might have that spread effects, that positive secondary effect of somehow being able to influence their value chains, their providers, etc., by taking action, by leading this movement in Portugal, the Act for Nature movement. So that we're really confident that we'll be able to, I mean, we've started with 17, hopefully we'll end up with 1,000 of them. And that's it. And I'm done for the moment. So I look forward for any questions that there might have, the audience might have now in the final panel for Q&A. Thank you for the opportunity, for this testimonial.
Thank you so much, João. And again, congratulations on this initiative. It's very exciting to see that you have now 17 companies that made this commitment. And I hope that the message was heard that other companies are now invited to join this initiative. So as you have the floor actually already, maybe let's start the Q&A session with me asking you a follow-up question on your very interesting presentation. And also I'm using this time as an opportunity to remind our audience that you can ask questions to our 4 panelists by clicking on the question mark button at the bottom of your screen. So João, you mentioned that when establishing Act for Nature Portugal, you actually learned a lot from the Act for Nature France and Act for Nature International experience. So can you tell us what has been the greatest challenge to convince companies to make a commitment to Act for Nature Portugal? And what would be your advice and lessons learned when creating this initiative in Portugal that you could give to other organizations that want to create a similar initiative in their country?
Thank you so much for your question. I think that, I mean, the two most challenging issues that we had to overcome in the beginning were, on one hand, companies tend to look at nature as some kind of romantic issue, like the birds and the dolphins and etc., the tigers. And it's not just about that conservation of the wildlife, even though we're emotionally attached to nature, and that's great. It's the Bambi from our childhood, and that's great that we have that asset, that sentimental asset, that nature does have that sentimental asset within our hearts. But I mean, it's a bit beyond that, or I wouldn't say beyond, but it's in parallel to that. It's half of the world's GDP relies on nature, on natural capital, because everything is filled up with nature. I mean, this mobile phone is nature, as you know, the computer, the cars, the medicines, the food, the clothes we're wearing. So as nature is all around us. We as Humberto just said, we're built upon nature. So companies they do not have this vision, and it's a bit harsh to get them and to share this vision that we really depend on nature. It's not just about keeping the dolphins happy, or it's really about jobs and economy, and it's really about the quality of life of the coming generations, and the options we leave on the table for them or not. And that's very serious. And the second most challenging issue we had to overcome was also, again, as Humberto said, I mean, the difficulty to measure. And companies are very analytical and very numbers driven. And it's easier with climate change because you can measure carbon, as you know, tons of something of greenhouse gas emissions. But regarding nature, it's a bit more loose, a bit more subjective. And so they tend to avoid these kinds of issues. I mean, just a final remark, we've just challenged a very well-known consultancy firm, I can say, McKinsey, to lead one of our projects, not this one, but another one. And we're having these discussions with many corporations and the help of this consultancy firm that, of course, they try to bring their own frameworks, and frameworks are great because someone said that what you can't measure, you can't improve, but we can't also become hostage of these analytical and numbers-driven frameworks, because there's life beyond that. And just because we can't now measure return on investment on nature, or measure impacts, or measure what else, doesn't mean that we shouldn't act. And alongside, we should make that effort towards numbers and metrics and frameworks. But we shouldn't wait to have them to act. And those were the two most challenging pieces to overcome.
I agree with you. Let's not wait. So maybe a question now for Pascale and Cédric. We have heard in the video CEOs, including the CEO of H&M, calling for stronger policies and regulation on nature. So from your perspective, what would be the most needed from governments to create this enabling environment for business to scale up their efforts on nature? And how could that help with your competitiveness? So maybe Pascale, if you want to share a few thoughts, and Cédric, you could add after that.
Thank you, Maelle, for the question. As Elena and Meeûs was saying in her speech, we really need new framework at policy level, and that should be based on targets and indicators, coming back to what João was saying, that companies drive also on numbers to also have an analysis there. But the indicator and the targets need to be based and informed by science, so that they will really put a bit more of consistency behind that, and also to have a common language across businesses, industries, and across governance to really drive the change. And one of our other call, which is a bit what the European Commission has been doing, actually, based on what Humberto was explaining, is to have a holistic approach when it comes to biodiversity, not to put it in a silo policy, but reintegrate it into all environmental package, but also transparency, informing customers on what they're buying, so they can have an informed choice. And I think this is really important. It really applauds the European Commission approach to reconnect biodiversity with other policies to ensure that it's linked with circular economy and climate, and really drive the change. So that's really something I would say the two key points we would like to push, and that are also connected to the Business for Nature call to action.
Cédric, would you like to add something to that?
Yes, I've got 3 points I would like to add, if I may, Maelle. The first one is referring back to what Humberto's mentioned, the chapter on measurement in the EU strategy. I think what we are looking for is the creation of science-based tools to measure, calculate, monitor, and demonstrate the value of ecosystem services, and including those created through site rehabilitation. And there are massive opportunities, and when I say massive in terms of hectares across Europe, interlinked hectares, and having as harmonized as possible science-based tools would really help. And that brings me to the second point, and the work I mentioned in my first intervention that we did with IUCN, which was at site level, and it showed many instances where the local requirement conflicted somehow with the best practice for biodiversity management, and that was linked to miscomprehension, lack of tools, legal rigidity and bureaucracy, and so on and so forth. And I think if we have science-based tools that are harmonized as possible, it would also help, and that maybe it's a second focus that the Commission could take, is to improve capacity building at the local level, because the biodiversity implementation always happens at the very local level, and enabling an easier, more effective implementation that enables all actors to go and choose the ideal best practice for biodiversity management in the end is what we need to land on. And to your second question on how does that improve our competitiveness, from a purely corporate perspective, we are increasingly looked at and assessed in terms of our ESG performances, and that includes biodiversity. So it's in the interest of our company to improve on a continual basis our biodiversity management performances. But the second point, which is just as important, is the ability through biodiversity management to mobilize local teams into an area of work in which we are all sensitive as human beings, and embedding this biodiversity management and the overall goal of stopping nature loss by 2030 is really a core value that becomes embedded in the company, that mobilizes the workforce, as I said, but also attracts talents for the future. So I think it's a win-win. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Cédric. So maybe Humberto, I'm not sure what you think, but I'm guessing that hearing such a clear message from the business community and actually asking for more ambitious policies is maybe not something that you were used to hear very often just a few years ago. So that shows this growing momentum. And we've heard from Cédric and Pascale the call for more harmonization, and also at international level. And the EU actually made a very strong statement at the last UN Biodiversity Convention virtual meeting, saying that the current level of ambition at the UN level is too low. And so how you explained a bit the strategy of the EU, but how is the EU planning to show leadership and influence these negotiations to ensure that we can have a transformative agreement adopted next year at the COP15?
Thank you, Maelle. Well, actually, I think there's only one way for the EU to influence or to lead, which is this leadership by example. When we come with the EU biodiversity strategy for 2030, yes, it also says what we want to get internationally, but it says, and that's the most important part, what we will do anyway within Europe. So when we come with such an ambitious EU nature restoration plan, for instance, when we say that we will get to 30% land and sea as protected areas effectively managed, 1/3 of which under strict protection. And when we quantify how we will reduce pressures and how we will bring new approaches and nature-based solutions, I think that's very telling, very influential. We are still not only a big bloc, we are a big economy, and we also have some reputation as EU that we do evaluate what we propose, we analyze, we set some standards that usually make some sense. So again, I don't mean at all that our solutions are to be applied everywhere, and I take good note of what Cédric said. Yes, indeed, you know, biodiversity is local. It's not like CO2. I emit my CO2 here, it goes to the global atmosphere, it influences everywhere. But I lose my nature nearby, my forest, my wetland, my fish in the coast and so forth. So indeed, this also applies elsewhere in the rest of the world. But we should all be united in addressing what are now known as the main direct drivers of loss, to begin land use change and sea change, overexploitation, climate change as such, pollution of all sorts, invasive alien species. Globally, we need a deal that also addresses this. It needs to address it in a quantified, measurable way. And very important for the global deal, we will need a governance methodology. We will need a process for monitoring, reviewing, ratcheting up the ambition as needed, having some independent science-based analysis through common headline indicators. This is a bit the process that climate change has followed in Paris Agreement. Yes, it's more difficult to measure ecosystems and biodiversity than tons of CO2 in the atmosphere or the percentage of CO2 in the atmosphere, but science is advancing. And business is advancing also on methods that can be used on several approaches. So here's some momentum that should allow the world, from sheer human need, it's our interest, is not for the sake of the wonder and beauty that nature does have. We strictly depend on it, and we are losing more and more wilderness, more of which services. So we need to make the world and Europe wilder again.
Thank you, Humberto. Thank you so much. I see actually that we have a question now from the audience, from Sophia, who is asking, to what extent do nature-based solutions driven by technology provide an opportunity for real change to be implemented at scale up? So maybe that's a question for a business representative. So maybe Pascale, do you want to take this question?
Sure. Thanks, Maelle. I will try to be as comprehensive as possible. So thanks a lot for the questions. What we are doing within H&M, it's kind of what I was saying, the link between circular economy and biodiversity. So we are trying to really have, we have actually targets, for at material level. And we are having targets regarding recycled and sustainably sourced materials. So that includes nature-based solutions, but not only that. And we want to really scale up this approach so that we decouple growth from resource use and therefore impact on biodiversity. And we also do that not only with the circular economy approach, but also with technology. And we have the innovation lab within H&M. And I'm not sure also if you're aware of the Global Change Awards that really put forward technologies, new materials, for example, scrap from food, for example, from grape. We created silk from that, and also from orange, there is leather. Those kind of, alternative materials that will not put stress on biodiversity and on resource use. So that's really what we are looking at. I hope it answers. And the way to scale up is that whenever we find those new innovation, new materials, we don't keep them to ourselves. The Innovation Lab is really there to provide the solution to the full industry and to scale up those startups and innovation, so everybody can use that. I hope it's answer your question, Sophia.
Thank you so much, Pascale. And I see we have actually another question from Dirk, and maybe that's one from you, Humberto. So Dirk is saying that it's great to have all those EU legislation and legislation in general, but if it's not enforced and implemented on the ground, then it doesn't really help the business community. So Humberto, could you tell us from your perspective, how can you at the EU ensure that all these strategies and policies are implemented and enforced on the ground?
That's a very relevant question indeed, because if we have the EU acquis on environmental legislation, we should first and foremost ensure it is really enforced. And let's imagine that everywhere in the EU, all environmental and nature legislation would be fully enforced. Of course, the situation would be better, but we would still be having a serious decline of biodiversity, because even where we have restored nature, and many success stories and cases, notably from regulation, but also financed, for instance, by the LIFE program, we have many success stories. It's simply that the rhythm of destruction and has outpaced the rhythm of reconstruction somehow. So yes, you will find in the biodiversity strategy a very clear reference to the need for a more thorough enforcement and implementation of the acquis, and we will certainly invest on that. Of course, there's also some resources needed for it, but that's the basis to build the transformative agenda that needs more. And actually, I do think that more regulation coming in will also steer innovation and many opportunities, including for business.
Thank you, Humberto. So I'm afraid we have to stop now this very interesting discussion as we're getting to the end of the session. But maybe before we close it, I would like to give the floor to each of you one more time for final reflection and final remark. So maybe Cédric first, could we have a final word from you?
Okay, and actually, I will use that time to answer one of the questions for participants, and whether business will commit to reduce consumptions. I think it's a relevant question, and I think many businesses have understood that the models are changing, and that in the world of construction, the built environment, the easiest way to save CO2, to use less resources, is to construct better, to plan better, is to use digital tools to optimize the resources that we use, is to collaborate across the entire value chain, from architects to engineering, construction companies, material providers that we are, to make sure that we optimize every step of the way and provide better material that are less resource intensive, that are less CO2 intensive, in order to respond to what we need. We still need to have buildings that are standing up, that resist external weather, that provides the living function that we are looking for. But we can respond to that if we collaborate across the value chains and integrate the different and interlink CO2 with circular economy, with nature. I'll stop there, I think.
Cédric. Pascale, a final word from you?
Just wanted to mention again the holistic approach that Cédric also just mentioned, to really include circular economy and climate into the approach, and to have that international lead from the European Commission. We really hope for that, and really push for the European Commission to keep on the great work on this. And also what is key from business is to have science-based targets and science-based measurement methods. This is really what will also we believe will drive the change. And we look forward to further working on raw materials to decouple growth from resource use, which is really key for biodiversity.
João, just a few words, because we have only 1 minute left, so thank you.
Just to add 2 R's to the 3 R's of the circular economy mantra. I think we talked a lot about circular economy. That's great. The transition from a linear model to a circular model. I mean, we all know the reduce, reuse, recycle, the 3 R's of the circular economy, the mantra. I would add 2 more, the refuse and the reinvent. In some cases, we need to move from reduce to refuse. And on other cases, in many cases, you need innovation, disruptive innovation towards sustainability, and that's the reinvent. So that I would add this refuse on one hand, and that's negative, but on the positive side of it, I would add the reinvent has a call for innovation towards sustainability at large scale. Thank you.
Wow. And Humberto, thank you again for joining us and for the EU to organize the EU Green Week. A final word from you?
A quick word is, I do think that nature is our best ally and is very misguided to fight our allies instead of working with them. So when we have this approach of nature-based solutions, I'll just give you an example. Imagine we would have a lovely technology to remove CO2 from the atmosphere, powered by sunlight, and with machines that would self-reproduce without further investment. Well, we have it from nature. That's called plants, photosynthesis. So we can use the green infrastructure together with the grey infrastructure, the nature-based solutions together with the technology, make that usable for business and build a new world.
Thank you, Humberto. And thank you so much to all of you for sharing such interesting insight during this session. It's very reassuring to see that given the current circumstances, nature and biodiversity are still high on the agenda, both for businesses and for governments. But we still have a long way to go to address this crisis, starting by having a great agreement next year at the Biodiversity COP15. So we need continued engagement from all of you. So thank you very much to all our speakers and our audience. And let's act now together to reverse nature loss in this decade. So have a great continuation of the EU Green Week, and goodbye, everyone.
Maelle for the moderation.
Thank you.